This is Capitol Hill. Welcome to the program. I'm Karen Binney. Tony Abbott's on his way home from Indonesia after completing his first overseas trip as Prime Minister. During the visit, he held talks with his Indonesian counterpart, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. They canvassed a range of issues, including trade and the contentious subject of people smuggling. The Prime Minister will return to Indonesia this weekend for the APEC summit in Bali. Well, Mr Abbott refused to say whether he discussed the details of his boat turn-back policy, but he says his discussions were frank and productive with Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono.
Everything was on the table yesterday. Nothing was off limits yesterday, and the clear agreement is that operational details will be dealt with on a no surprises basis.
One of the announcements from the trip is an Australian Centre for Indonesian Studies based at Monash University. It's designed to boost cultural, business, educational and research links between the two countries. For more on Mr Abbott's trip, I spoke earlier to Professor David Hill from the Southeast Asia Research Centre at Murdoch University. David Hill, welcome to Capitol Hill.
Thanks.
Tony Abbott's been in Indonesia this week talking about Australia's border protection policy, but he's also been mentioning trade and education ties. Do you think he's struck the right balance between asserting Australia's position on border protection and developing those relationships, those other relationships with the country?
Yes, look, it is important that the impression be given that Australia recognises and values the breadth of the relationship that we have with Indonesia. So it certainly would have been unfortunate if there'd been an excessive focus on those areas of tension, such as the border asylum seeker issue. So it's very important that that be placed in a much richer context to show that we have expanding trade connections, particularly education is a very important and growing area of our collaboration. So yes, I think overall it was well pitched.
We might come back to education shortly, but just staying on the boats policy, Tony Abbott wants to turn back boats to Indonesia where it's safe to do so. Indonesia in the past has said it's not happy with that plan and has raised objections. Do you think that on the ground in Indonesia it's a real issue for the Indonesian government or not?
I think we have to distinguish between the reaction of the general public and the reaction of the Indonesian government. It's certainly an issue that the Indonesian government recognises as a potential problem in its dealings with the Abbott government. The Indonesian government has no interest in extending this issue, in making it more difficult to manage than it needs to be. In terms of the reaction from the Indonesian public more generally, I would think it's fair to say that they're somewhat perplexed as to why this issue, which seems to loom so little in the opinion of the Indonesian community, should be regarded by the Abbott government as such a deal breaker, as such a major issue upon which they're hooking their entire reputation and relationship, not just with Indonesia but more broadly with ASEAN. For the Indonesian community at large, there are vastly more important issues than a few thousand people using their country as a transit path to Australia.
Do you think the attitudes of the Indonesian government have been changing in recent times?
I don't think the attitudes of the government have changed substantially at all. I think my reading of the situation is that the people that matter, the President, the Foreign Minister, have taken the view that they are going to allow the meeting to take place with all the appropriate diplomatic niceties, but that the more complex issue of how this will be managed on a day-to-day basis will be actually pushed back and if you like, dealt with in the back rooms, in the discussions between those who have operational charge of these issues. So at a public level, we have this managed quite diplomatically, quite cordially, but the Indonesians have flagged that this is a serious issue, that they're not going to budge on this, and that it will have to be worked out in a more discreet manner than might have been initially the intention of the Australians.
Well, on that, there's bilateral talks going to continue between Foreign Minister Julie Bishop and the Immigration Minister Scott Morrison and their Indonesian counterparts. Is that an indication of how important this issue is to the Indonesians, and that they want to solve this directly with Australia rather than in the broader region?
Well, I would pose the question as to why the Immigration Minister, Scott Morrison, in fact wasn't part of this delegation. Was it in fact to enable the discussions to be postponed rather than dealt with during this initial visit? I think it's entirely appropriate, of course, that the foreign ministers, that the Immigration Minister and counterparts be involved in ongoing discussions on this issue. It's not an issue that's going to go away. It's going to have to be managed in the weeks, months, years ahead. And it will be managed both at a bilateral level through these sorts of discussions, as well as I understand to be the Indonesian government's preference, through the multilateral Bali process.
Tony Abbott said he wants to focus on Jakarta rather than Geneva in his approach to foreign policy. Does that sit well with, do you think, with other countries in the region?
Well, Indonesia is the largest economy in ASEAN. It's one of the main drivers of the ASEAN economies. Indonesia is well regarded within the region. It's taken a leadership role in a whole range of different ways. I don't think it would provide any surprises for other countries in ASEAN that Australia would rightfully and appropriately recognise the primacy of its relationship with Indonesia in the region.
Trade was also one of the issues on the table at the meetings between Tony Abbott and Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. There's also education on the table as well. They're going to set up an Indonesian studies centre in Australia with a number of nodes. Is that a good idea, and will that better facilitate the swapping of students between Indonesia and Australia as the Abbott government wants?
Look, it is a tremendously encouraging sign that the Australian government is now investing in building up our skills base in Indonesian studies. This is a problem that had been recognised by scholars for more than a decade. We've had a generation of senior Indonesianists retiring. We are attracting into studies a smaller and smaller pool of students who are going through the education process and developing high-level expertise to do with Indonesia. And it's absolutely essential that Australia recruit, train and send out into the workforce an expanding cohort of well-informed, well-educated Indonesian speakers who have a deep and abiding understanding of our neighbour. And so in that context, it's very important that this new study centre has been set up. It is, however, only one step, and we need to be moving not simply on the areas to do with research relating to Indonesia. We need also to be investing in the training of high school students and undergraduate students in Indonesian language. After all, if the communication flows between Australia and Indonesia are to be smooth, are to be mutually beneficial, to be productive, then we have to be producing Australians who have high-level competence and fluency in Indonesian language. And that, sadly, is a diminishing pool. We're not producing enough graduates with high-level Indonesian language skills to replace retiring workforce.
What more can be done to boost trade relations between the two countries? Tony Abbott made the point earlier today that Australia has a higher proportion of trade with New Zealand, and it's 4 million people, as opposed to Indonesia with its 250 million people.
Yes, it's universally accepted that our trade relationship has been underachieving. Indonesia is, I think, only our 12th largest trading partner. We have a much greater complementarity in our economies than is being realised. And there needs to be much more encouragement for Australian companies to be investing in Indonesia and Indonesian companies to be investing in Australia. It's certainly very unfortunate that when those sorts of investments are flagged in Jakarta, that we have the sort of reactions that we've seen recently from ministers of the new Abbott government when the kind of nationalist jingoistic rhetoric has been ramped up as if there is some reason to be concerned about Indonesian investment in Australia. This is an entirely reasonable, natural, predictable step in the entwining of the Australian and Indonesian economies. Just as Australians want to invest in Indonesia, so we must encourage Indonesians to be investing in Australia.
Professor Hill, that's where we'll have to leave it. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
Well, joining me on today's panel is Labor's Don Farrell in Adelaide, and in Brisbane, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer, Steve Ciobo. Welcome to you both, gentlemen.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you, Karen.
Well, we'll start with the Prime Minister's trip to Indonesia, and Mr Abbott says nothing was off the table during his talks with his Indonesian counterpart, but he also says he'll do nothing to jeopardise Indonesia's sovereignty. Acting Labor leader Chris Bowen says the Prime Minister should be more upfront about what he's talking about.
He needs to be clear with the Australian people as to what that means. Given that Indonesia has made it very clear that they regard turning back the boats, buying the boats and paying bounties in Indonesia as a threat to their sovereignty, what does the Prime Minister mean when he says he will respect Indonesia's sovereignty? Does it mean that the turn back the boats policy is being dropped? Does it mean that the buy back the boats policy is being abolished? Does it mean that the bounties policy is not proceeding?
Steve Ciobo, is there a point there from Chris Bowen? Will there be any changes to the immigration policy? Tony Abbott didn't spell out whether there would or wouldn't be in that.
Well, there'll be no changes to the immigration policy. What's going on here is that we've got a meddlesome Labor Party, frankly, Karen. I mean, the Labor Party created this whole problem. They had a solution, they changed the laws, they caused the influx of 50,000 asylum seekers, the influx of over 800 boats that's now resulted in over 1,000 deaths at sea. So frankly, the last person who should be weighing into this debate is actually the man who in many respects started all of that, and that's Chris Bowen. I think the Labor Party needs to just take a cool, deep breath and wander off somewhere for a little while, because the last thing we need at a time when Australia is in discussions with Indonesia about stopping the people smuggling trade is the Labor Party sitting over on the sidelines throwing rocks and trying to cause problems, when in reality what we want to do is clean up the mess that Labor caused.
But Tony Abbott's the man that's in Indonesia holding these talks. He says that he'll respect Indonesia's sovereignty, and but on top of that, he also says he's 100% committed to his policy that he took to the election. That includes boat turnarounds, and Indonesia has expressed some issues with that in the past.
Well, look, I've no doubt that Indonesia's expressed, some of their domestic considerations, and likewise we've expressed some of our domestic considerations. At the end of the day, Karen, what's taking place here is this. There are sovereignty considerations on both sides of the fence. We know that obviously each time an Indonesian flagged vessel comes from Indonesia with asylum seekers that's been paid to organised criminals to bring them to Australia, putting literally hundreds of lives on the line, that's an impact on our sovereignty. But what's important here is that the discussions that have taken place already have been warm. They're discussions that are advancing the relationship between our two countries forward. And it's very clear as well that Indonesia is very willing to work in a bilateral way with Australia, as well as in a multilateral way through the Bali process. So the fact is that this has been a very successful visit. There'll be good outcomes that flow from this, and I've no doubt that in time we'll see that we will stop the boats.
Don Farrell, Labor did have a problem with boats, and it probably contributed a little bit to the election loss as well. It was a big issue at the election. Tony Abbott has managed to continue bilateral talks. Julie Bishop will have more talks in Indonesia. Scott Morrison will have more talks in Indonesia on boats with the Indonesian officials. Should Labor have tried a little bit harder with Indonesia to get better cooperation on that side?
Look, I think, Karen, we did do that. We did try to have good relations with Indonesia. Indonesia is one of our most important neighbours. It's a very large country to our north, and I think what Tony Abbott has to be careful about is that he doesn't do anything that damages our long-term relationship with this country. I think the issue that Chris Bowen made is exactly right. We need to know what it is that Tony Abbott has been discussing with the Indonesians. Sure, the boat people issue has been a difficult issue. It's been difficult for the Labor Party. If they're not careful, then of course it'll be a difficult issue for the Liberal Party. We want a cooperative relationship with Indonesia. We want a positive relationship with Indonesia, but we also want to know what it is that Tony Abbott is discussing with the Indonesians. I think that's the minimum that Tony Abbott can tell the Australian people.
Don Farrell, though, isn't it expected that not everything that is said in between two leaders of two different countries is broadcast in the media?
Well, I think on this issue, I think Steve rather understated the role of asylum seekers and the boat people in the campaign that Tony Abbott waged against the Labor Party for more than 3 years. The Liberals ran this issue very strongly at the last election. Tony Abbott didn't stop talking about this issue for the whole of the election campaign. I think now that he's having discussions with the Indonesians, we need to know as a country what it is that he's talking about with the Indonesians, and we have to be satisfied that whatever it is that he's saying to the Indonesians will not jeopardise our long-term relationship with this most important neighbour.
Well, Tony Abbott wanted the focus of his trip to be on trade, and he's got 21 Australian business leaders travelling with him, along with the Trade Minister, Andrew Robb. Mr Abbott says Indonesia has plenty of untapped potential.
It's a little embarrassing that Australia's two-way trade with New Zealand's 4 million people is currently greater than our two-way trade with Indonesia's 250 million people. I want to increase trade with New Zealand, but I certainly want to increase trade and investment with Indonesia, and there is vast upside scope for this. 1% would be about a doubling of where we are now, but let's not be content with that.
Steve Ciobo, has there been any modelling done on what exactly could be done to boost the trade between Australia and any sort of monetary value that could be put on that?
Well, clearly what we want to do is make sure that we broaden and deepen the relationship with Indonesia, and quite clearly if we forge a stronger relationship and closer economic ties, then we'll be able to make sure that there are significant job benefits that flow from that, significant investment benefits that flow from that, as well as, of course, generating additional revenue for government.
What sort of benefits are we looking at?
Well, Karen, I mean, it all depends on whether it's services or goods and the way in which we actually ultimately bring about a closer relationship with Indonesia. I'd make the point, though, that, and in many respects, as an Australian government, we want to build off where we've been. Now, we know the relationship has been particularly troubled over the past 5 years under Labor. We saw the knee-jerk reaction from the Labor Party, for example, on live cattle exports to Indonesia, where overnight they turned off, in many respects, Indonesia's meat supply. So we've had a lot of low points. What we want to do now is bring the focus back onto the positives, bring the focus back on the mutual benefits that will flow for Indonesia and Australia. And the reality is that there are a lot of domestic benefits that flow from an enhanced trade relationship. And as I said, generating 1 million new jobs within 5 years was a key part of our election platform. And one of the ways we can realise that goal is by boosting trade with Indonesia.
Don, was it a mistake to ban live exports to Indonesia?
Look, it was an extremely difficult issue for the Labor Party and in particular Joe Ludwig to deal with in government. Look, it's very clear that during the period of the final period of the Labor government, we fixed that issue. We don't want it to be a source of ongoing dispute. But look, I think the important thing is nobody in the Labor Party disagrees with trying to improve our trading relationships and the volume of trade with the Indonesians. I think what we're concerned about is that the attitude that Tony Abbott is taking on this issue of asylum seekers has the potential to do that very thing that he claims he doesn't want to do. We don't want to have a dispute over asylum seekers with the Indonesians. That does affect negatively our trading relationship with this country. We want a good relationship with Indonesia. We need a good relationship for a whole lot of reasons, including strategic reasons. And we certainly don't want anything that Tony Abbott is doing now to jeopardise that long-term relationship.
Well, as expected today, still on the economy, the Reserve Bank left interest rates on hold at the historic low end of 2.5%. Steve Ciobo, you're the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer. Is this a sign of a strong economy or a weak one?
Well, I think it's a sign that there's growing consumer confidence again, and in fact in the Reserve Bank statement they actually specifically highlighted this point, Karen. So I think what we're seeing is that there's been a sense of relief in many respects from the Australian people that finally we've put the turmoil and the tumult and the infighting of the last 6 years under the Labor Party behind us. We have seen on all the economic indicators a very strong surge in consumer sentiment, a very strong surge in business sentiment. Now, the Reserve Bank makes the point that what we need to watch is whether this is a one-off bounce or whether it continues. Obviously, the focus of the Abbott government is to make sure that we keep consumer confidence strong. That's why we've gone out of our way to say no unexpected surprises. We want to manage in Australia's national interest, we want to drive investment, we want to drive unemployment down. And if we tick all those boxes, I've no doubt we'll continue to see the Australian economy strengthen.
Don, I'll ask you the same question. A weak or a strong economy?
Well, I guess it's a sign that there's a stable arrangement at the moment in terms of interest rates. I guess we left the Liberals with a AAA rating. We want Australia to keep a AAA rating. The concern I think most people would have is that if Tony Abbott or Joe Hockey do anything that in any way destabilises the economic arrangements in Australia, of course then we could see a far more difficult circumstances arise. The Labor government wants people in jobs. We like low interest rates. We think that's a good thing. We like our AAA rating. But the most important thing from the point of view of the Labor Party is to ensure that we have a regime that keeps people employed, keeps them in long-term employment, and so if maintaining the interest rates at the level that they've been maintained at does that, well, that's a good thing. But we certainly don't want Tony Abbott or Joe Hockey to be doing anything that prejudices the opportunities for people to find employment.
Steve, during before the election and when you were still in opposition, Joe Hockey did make a point when interest rates were going down, saying that this is a sign of a weakening economy. Can you have it both ways? The interest rates are still at those record low levels.
Well, what we said was the point that the former Labor Treasurer Wayne Swan made when he said interest rates when they were at 2.75% were at emergency levels. They were Wayne Swan's words, not the Coalition's words. We know that the official cash rate's now at 2.5%, so it's even lower than it was when Wayne Swan made that pronouncement. You know, and the problem, Karen, is this, is that for all the rhetoric that comes from Don about how Labor's concerned about making sure that people have jobs and announcements about having a strong economy and no unexpected surprises, the reality is that under Labor we saw the unemployment queues grow by about 275,000 people. Under Labor we saw business confidence decline. Under Labor we saw unexpected overnight changes like, for example, the changes to FBT, like a Prime Minister who said there'd be no carbon tax under the government I lead, only to turn around and introduce one. So I really think that most Australians don't want to be lectured by the Labor Party and also don't want the kind of glib rhetoric that we've heard from Don about how they're so concerned about unemployment, yet they presided over a system that saw unemployment increase on their watch.
All right, Don, one more question for you. This afternoon the AEC has delivered the election results for the Senate and you have missed out on a spot. Should you have given your first spot away to Penny Wong?
Look, it's an occupational hazard of being a politician, Karen, that you lose elections from time to time. I made the decision to vacate that top spot because there was destabilisation in the Labor Party. I put the Labor Party first. I still believe that was the correct decision, and I'll stand by my decision.
It has cost you your job, though.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of people in a far worse position than me, Karen. You know, there's Holden workers in this state who've lost their jobs. The important thing, I think, is that unlike what Steve just said, I think what I'd like to see is a growing economy, an economy where the Australian government creates jobs, not destroys them. I think that was what was the last Labor government was all about.
All right,
Your
gentlemen,
government just never did it.
we are going to have to leave it there. That's all we've got time for in today's Capitol Hill.
Thanks,
Steve
Karen.
Ciobo, Don Farrell, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Karen.
And that's Capitol Hill. We'll see you tomorrow.